The HOA sent me a letter demanding $250,000 in fines for violations on my own land. They claimed I had broken rules that I never agreed to. They gave me 30 days to pay or face legal action. I stayed calm and asked for the property records. The HOA president laughed and said the rules were final. Neighbors gathered as phones started recording. They believed I had no power. They believed I would be forced to pay. They believed the HOA owned everything around me. What they did not know was that the land they were fining me for was legally mine. Before I tell you what happened next, please tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. The HOA sent me a letter demanding $250,000 in fines for violations on my own land. It arrived in a thick envelope, heavier than a normal notice, stamped with words meant to intimidate instead of inform. Final warning, immediate action required. Failure to comply will result in legal consequences, the kind of language designed to make people panic before they even finish reading the first paragraph. They claimed I had broken multiple HOA rules. They claimed my property was out of compliance. They claimed I had ignored previous warnings that I had never received. According to them, my land had unauthorized structures, improper boundaries, and unapproved use. They cited articles, sections, subsections, and amendments from a rulebook I had never signed. They added late fees, enforcement fees, inspection fees, and something called community impact penalties. By the time I reached the final page, the total was already printed in bold, $250,000, due in 30 days. No exceptions. I read the letter again, slowly this time, not because I was confused, but because I was trying to understand the confidence behind it. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was written by people who believed, without hesitation, that they had the power to demand $250,000 from me and expect compliance. I did not feel anger at first. I felt curiosity. I had owned this land long before the HOA existed. I remembered the property before the paved roads, before the identical houses, before the decorative street signs with their carefully chosen fonts. I remembered dirt, survey stakes, and conversations with developers who promised paperwork would be handled later. Later never came. Instead of calling the number listed on the letter, I drove to the HOA office. I walked in calmly, the envelope still folded under my arm. The receptionist looked at me the way people look at someone who is already in trouble. "I received this notice," I said, placing it on the counter. "I'd like to see the property records you're using." She barely glanced at the letter before sliding it back toward me. "All violations are final," she said. "You'll need to schedule a compliance hearing." "I'm not disputing a rule," I replied. "I'm asking for the deed." That was the moment her expression changed. She made a phone call. A door opened. The HOA president stepped out like this was a performance she had rehearsed. She smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had never been challenged. "You're refusing to comply?" she asked. "I'm asking a question," I said. "Can you show me proof that the HOA owns or controls the land you fined me for?" She laughed, not nervously, confidently, loud enough for people in the lobby to hear. "We don't need to prove ownership," she said. "The rules apply to everyone." By now, neighbors had started to gather. Someone lifted a phone, then another. People recognized the envelope. They had received smaller versions of it before. Most of them had paid. Some of them were still paying. I stayed calm. I asked again, "Can you show me the property record?" She crossed her arms and shook her head. "You're not special," she said. "If you live here, you follow the rules." "I don't live there," I said quietly. "I live here." She dismissed me with a wave of her hand. "You have 30 days, she said. "After that, our legal team will proceed." They believed I had no power. They believed I would panic. They believed I would borrow money, sell something, or beg for a payment plan. They believed what most HOAs believe, that authority does not need proof if fear does the job. What they did not know was that I had never transferred ownership of the land beneath their neighborhood. What they did not know was that their boundaries were assumed, not verified. What they did not know was that the very records they avoided were the ones that would undo everything they claimed. As I walked out, I could feel the eyes on my back. Some were curious, some were sympathetic, some looked relieved that the attention was not on them for once. No one said a word. That night, I spread the letter out on my kitchen table. I read every citation, every claim, every threat. Then I opened a separate folder, one I had kept for years without ever needing it. Inside were surveys, plats, and county filings older than the HOA itself. and for the first time since that envelope arrived, I smiled. The HOA did not start as a villain. That is how they always survive for so long. When the neighborhood was first built, the HOA presented itself as protection. Protection for property values. Protection for aesthetics. Protection from problem neighbors who might park the wrong car, paint the wrong color, or live the wrong way. People signed without reading too closely because the language sounded reasonable and the promises sounded comforting. Order, stability, community. What those words slowly became was control. At first, the rules were small. Lawns had to be trimmed regularly. Trash bins could not be left out overnight. Fences had to follow a specific height and style. Most people complied without complaint. No one wanted to be that neighbor. Then the rules multiplied. Grass height was measured with rulers, not approximated, measured. 1. Woman received a warning because her lawn was half an inch taller near the mailbox where the sun hit differently. Another family was fined because their holiday lights were still up on January 6th even though they were out of town due to a funeral. There were rules about where you could park, even on your own driveway. Rules about how long guests could stay. Rules about what kind of plants were acceptable, which colors were approved, and which window coverings were considered an eyesore. The HOA board loved enforcing these rules. You could see it in the way they spoke at meetings. They did not talk like neighbors. They talked like judges. Every discussion had consequences. Every disagreement sounded like defiance. People tried to push back at first. A retired man questioned a fine for his shed, pointing out that it had existed before the HOA was formed. They fined him again for failure to remove. A young couple asked why they needed approval for solar panels. The request sat unanswered for 6 months, while fines continued to accumulate. A single mother asked for leniency when her car broke down and remained in her driveway for 3 days. The board denied it without discussion. Eventually, people stopped asking. Fear is not loud, it is quiet. It sounds like checks being written in silence. It looks like neighbors lowering their voices when HOA members walk by. It feels like avoiding eye contact during meetings so your name is not remembered. The HOA knew this. They relied on it. Their enforcement letters were carefully written. They never sounded emotional. They sounded absolute. Every notice included the same phrase, failure to comply will result in further action. No one ever explained what further action meant. They did not need to. The imagination did the work for them. What stood out to me was not how strict they were, but where they were strict. They enforced rules aggressively on individual homeowners. They measured lawns, inspected porches, photographed trash cans, and documented driveways. But whenever someone asked about shared spaces, roads, sidewalks, common land, the answers became vague. Those areas were always described as HOA-controlled, never HOA-owned. It was a small detail, but it mattered. I attended several HOA meetings after receiving my fine, not to argue but to observe. I listened to how they spoke to residents. I watched which questions made them uncomfortable. Every time someone mentioned land boundaries, easements, or original deeds, the board redirected the conversation. That's not relevant. That's been settled. That's not up for discussion. Rules were their shield. Paperwork was their weakness. They cited bylaws constantly but avoided county records. They referenced authority but never origin. It was as if the HOA existed in a bubble, separate from the legal foundations that made ownership real. One evening, a neighbor stood up during open comments. He was older, nervous, clearly not used to speaking in front of groups. I just want to understand, he said, who actually owns the strip of land behind our homes? The room went quiet. The HOA president smiled politely and said, that's HOA land. He asked, is there a deed? She replied, that information isn't necessary for residents. That was the moment I knew this was not about order. It was about assumption. They assumed no one would check. They assumed no one would challenge them. They assumed authority was permanent, simply because it had gone untested. The fines reinforced that assumption. Every penalty trained people to comply faster next time. Every threat discouraged questions. Over time, the HOA stopped feeling like a group of neighbors and started feeling like something unavoidable, like weather. You did not argue with it. You prepared for it. When my $250,000 fine became known, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors avoided me, afraid association with me might put them on the HOA's radar. Others quietly expressed support, whispering that the board had gone too far this time. A few told me stories they had never shared before, about fines that came without warnings, about appeals that were ignored, about legal threats sent to people who barely had enough to cover groceries. The rules were never applied equally. People connected to the board received reminders. Everyone else received penalties. Still, no one had beaten them. That was their greatest strength. They had built a reputation on inevitability, on the idea that resistance was expensive and compliance was cheaper. They were not bullies in the traditional sense. They were bureaucrats with time, paper, and confidence. But confidence collapses when facts enter the room. They loved their rules because rules gave them power without requiring proof. They could point to a paragraph and end a conversation. They could say policy and make human context disappear. What they did not realize was that rules only matter when they are built on something real. And real ownership does not come from bylaws or meetings or titles like president. It comes from records that do not change just because someone wants them to. While they were busy measuring grass and counting days, I was preparing to measure something else, the ground beneath their authority. And once that was measured correctly, nothing they enforced would survive the weight of the truth. I did not go back to the HOA after the meeting. I did not send an angry email. I did not hire a lawyer, at least not yet. Instead, I went somewhere far less dramatic and far more dangerous to people who rely on intimidation. I went to the county records office. It was an old building, the kind that smelled faintly of paper and dust no matter how often it was cleaned. The walls were lined with notices no one read, and the waiting area was filled with people dealing with divorces, property disputes, and estates. Real problems, real consequences, no posturing. I took a number and waited. When my turn came, I approached the counter and told the clerk exactly what I needed. I did not mention the HOA. I did not mention fines. I simply asked for the original plats and deeds associated with the land before the subdivision existed. The clerk paused and looked up at me. "How far back?" she asked. "As far back as it goes," I said. She nodded slowly, as if that answer told her something. She disappeared into the back and returned with a cart stacked with folders. Thick ones, worn at the edges, labeled in handwriting older than the neighborhood itself. "These don't get requested very often," she said. That did not surprise me. Most people assume what they are told is true. They assume the present reflects the past accurately. They assume someone else already checked. That assumption is where power hides. I sat at a long table and began opening folders. The earliest document showed the land before development. Wide, uninterrupted parcels, survey lines drawn carefully by hand, coordinates that had nothing to do with street names or lot numbers because those things did not exist yet. Then came the developer filings. I recognized the name immediately. I remembered the meetings, the promises, the assurances that everything would be handled properly. I remembered being told that certain transfers would occur after construction, once the subdivision was finalized. I kept reading. Page by page, the story unfolded, not as it was told later, but as it actually happened. The developer purchased land. The developer subdivided it. The developer sold lots to homeowners, but one section W as different. The roads, the common strips, the land beneath the signage and sidewalks. Those parcels were never transferred. They were referenced, they were described, they were assumed, but legally they were never conveyed. My name appeared where the HOAs should have been, not once, not ambiguously. Clearly, the land they claimed authority over, the land they fined me for, was still mine. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This was not a loophole. This was not a technicality. This was a failure so basic it was almost unbelievable. The HOA had been enforcing rules on land it did not own for years. They had collected fines, they had issued threats, they had scared people into compliance, all without standing. I asked the clerk to make certified copies. She raised an eyebrow. "Planning something big?" "I'm planning something accurate," I said. She smiled. Back at home, I spread the documents across my table the same way I had with the fine letter. The difference was that these papers did not threaten. They simply stated facts, ownership, boundaries, dates, no opinions, no interpretations, no emotional language, just truth. I began comparing the HOA's claims to the records. Every violation cited HOA-controlled property. None cited ownership. Every rule assumed jurisdiction. None established it. They had built an entire system on a foundation they never verified. The realization was sobering. Not because I felt powerful, but because I understood how many people had been hurt by this negligence, how many fines had been paid, how many disputes had been lost simply because no one had gone far enough back. The HOA had not hidden the truth. They had relied on people not looking. That night I drafted a response to the fine. It was not long. It was not emotional. It included copies of the records. I did not accuse. I did not threaten. I asked questions. I asked to identify the deed granting them authority over my land. I asked them to reconcile their claims with county filings. I asked them to explain how fines were issued without ownership. Then I waited. The response did not come immediately. Instead, something else happened. The HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. Not a routine meeting, not a monthly meeting, an emergency meeting. Neighbors began whispering, emails circulated, people speculated. The board did not announce an agenda. They did not have to. They knew the record had been read. For the first time since the HOA existed, their authority was about to be questioned not by emotion, but by documentation. Not by complaints, but by facts they could not vote away. I looked again at the documents on my table. They were quiet, unimpressive, unintimidating, and yet they held more power than every rulebook, fine notice, and threat the HOA had ever issued. Because authority that cannot prove its origin does not survive scrutiny, and scrutiny was finally coming. The notice for the emergency HOA meeting was sent out late in the evening. It was brief, vague, and unusually polite. No accusations, no warnings. Just a date, a time, and a reminder that attendance was strongly encouraged. People noticed. HOA meetings were usually predictable. They followed a script. The board sat at the front. Residents sat quietly. Complaints were acknowledged, dismissed, and documented. This felt different. This felt rushed. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. Cars lined the street in a way that would normally earn half the neighborhood a citation. No one seemed worried about it tonight. Inside, the room buzzed with low conversations. People leaned toward each other, whispering theories and half-known facts. Some avoided eye contact with board members as they passed. Others stared openly, curiosity outweighing fear. For once, the board sat at the front table, but their posture was different. No relaxed confidence, no casual jokes. Papers were stacked carefully. Laptops were open. The HOA president kept adjusting her glasses, flipping through documents she had clearly read too many times already. I took a seat near the middle of the room. I did not bring a lawyer. I did not bring a recorder. I brought a folder. When the meeting was called to order, the president cleared her throat and launched into procedural language. Approval of minutes, acknowledgement of attendance, a reminder to keep comments brief and respectful. Her voice sounded steady, but her hands betrayed her. She gripped the edge of the table as if grounding herself. Then she looked directly at me. "We will begin," she said, "by addressing a concern that has recently been raised regarding property boundaries." A murmur moved through the room. She tried to frame it carefully. She spoke about confusion, about historical documentation, about interpretation differences. She avoided the words fine and ownership as long as she could. When she finally invited me to speak, the room fell completely silent. I stood and walked to the front, placing my folder on the table. I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I simply opened it. "I received a fine," I said, "a large one." Before responding, I requested the original county records for the land in question. I held up the first document. "This is the original plat," I said, "filed before the subdivision existed." I placed it on the table. "This is the developer's transfer," I continued. "It shows which parcels were conveyed and which were not." Another document joined the first. "And this," I said, "is the current deed." I turned to face the board. "Can you show me the deed that gives the HOA ownership or jurisdiction over this land?" No one spoke. The HOA president, Glenn, said to her left, then to her right. Another board member leaned forward, flipping through his own papers as if the answer might suddenly appear. "This meeting is not a legal forum," she finally said. "I agree," I replied. "It is a factual one." That was when the questions started coming, not from me, but from the room. A neighbor asked who actually owned the roads. Another asked why fines had been issued without proof of authority. Someone asked how long the board had known about the missing transfer. Each question landed heavier than the last. The board attempted to regain control. They cited bylaws. They referenced long-standing practice. They spoke about assumed authority and community standards. But assumptions do not survive documents. One board member finally admitted what everyone could see. "We relied on the developer's representations," he said quietly. "And no one verified them?" someone asked. Silence answered. The room shifted. People were no longer afraid to speak. Years of frustration found their voice all at once. Stories poured out, fines paid under pressure, threats of liens, warnings sent without hearings. The HOA president tried to pause the meeting. "We need to consult legal counsel," she said. "You already should have," someone replied. At that point, I spoke again, not to attack but to clarify. "I am not here to punish anyone," I said. I am here to stop something that should never have happened. I explained the implications simply. Without ownership or proper easements, the HOA had no authority to issue fines on that land. Any enforcement based on that assumption was invalid. Potentially refundable, that word, refundable, hit the room like a shockwave. The board realized it at the same time everyone else did. This was not a single fine in question. This was everything. The president called for a recess. The board huddled together, whispering, gently. Phones came out. Messages were sent. Damage control had begun. When they returned, the tone had changed completely. The fine against me was withdrawn pending review. All enforcement actions related to common areas were suspended. A full audit of property records was announced. No one applauded. People were processing what it meant. The meeting adjourned early. No closing remarks. No confidence. Just exhaustion. As people filed out, something remarkable happened. They stood taller. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before exchanged looks of understanding. Some thanked me quietly. Others simply nodded. The HOA members left through a side door. They did not meet anyone's eyes. The meeting that was meant to contain the problem had exposed it instead. Authority built on assumption had been forced into the light, and it could not survive there. Nothing was officially resolved that night, but everything had changed. Because once people see that power can be questioned, it never fully returns to its old shape, and the HOA knew it. The morning after the emergency meeting, the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't something tangible, like construction or new signage. It was a quiet, subtle shift, like air pressure changing before a storm. People walked a little taller. They opened doors to speak to neighbors they had never talked to before. They left blinds partially open. Some even left small garden decorations out, fearless of fines that might never come. The invisible weight that had pressed on the community for decades was lifting. Just a fraction at first, but it was enough. I received texts, calls, and even knocks at my door from people I barely knew. The first came from Mrs. Hargrove, a woman who had been fined countless times for lawn violations and had paid without protest because she couldn't afford legal battles. "Thank you," she said quietly. Clutching my hand, they never had a right to do it. No one ever told me that. That was the moment I realized the scale of what was happening. The HOA had been operating under the assumption that people wouldn't check the records, that their authority was untouchable because no one would question it. But now the assumption had crumbled. The next calls were from families who had quietly been paying fines for things they didn't even understand. Parking infractions, holiday decorations, tree trimming that wasn't even part of the rules. Some shared stories of neighbors who had been threatened with liens. Others spoke of fear of confrontation, fear of being labeled the problem neighbor, fear of standing out. People were waking up, and with awakening comes action. I spent the next few days meeting with neighbors in small groups. No lawyers, no official agendas, just people talking about their rights, sharing copies of property records, comparing notes on violations, and for the first time, realizing the extent of the misinformation they had been fed. The realization was electrifying. The HOA had relied on silence and obedience. Now silence was gone. The HOA tried to maintain control. Their first attempt was an email sent to all residents, worded carefully to sound authoritative but vaguely supportive. It thanked people for attending the emergency meeting and reminded everyone that the HOA's purpose was to maintain the integrity and value of our community. It sounded hollow. Next, the board held a special committee meeting, ostensibly to discuss the concerns raised about property boundaries. But it was clear to everyone who attended that it was a desperate attempt to salvage credibility. Their body language betrayed them. Their words were careful and rehearsed. They were no longer in control. Then something remarkable happened. Residents began speaking up in that meeting. Questions were no longer polite whispers. They were pointed, fact-based challenges. "How can fines be enforced on land you don't own?" asked a middle-aged man who had been fined for a mailbox that allegedly violated design standards. "Where is the deed that gives the HOA jurisdiction over common areas?" asked another. "And why were residents penalized while the board itself never verified ownership?" A young woman chimed in, her voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. The room grew tense. The board members fumbled through papers, exchanged nervous glances, and tried to redirect the conversation. But it was too late. The room had shifted. The momentum belonged to the residents now. By the end of that meeting, the HOA quietly agreed to halt all enforcement actions related to common areas pending a full legal review. No one cheered, but everyone left with a sense of quiet triumph. The power shift was not instantaneous. It didn't happen overnight. But the tide had turned, and that made all the difference. Residents were emboldened. They stopped paying fines without questioning them. They stopped taking board threats at face value. They began filing requests for records, challenging previous fines, and documenting violations of HOA procedure. Some board members tried to resist, attempting to assert authority in subtle ways, sending emails that implied rules were still valid, making phone calls with thinly veiled threats. But those attempts were ignored. People no longer feared them. They had seen the proof. They had seen the records. They had seen that the HOA had been wrong for years. The shift extended beyond enforcement. People began to talk about governance, about accountability, about transparency. Meetings that had once been perfunctory exercises in formality now became forums for discussion and oversight. The board could no longer operate in secrecy. Residents had power, and they were learning to exercise it. One by one, small victories accumulated. One resident received a refund for a fine issued erroneously. Another had a notice rescinded simply by producing property records. Gradually, the HOA learned that authority without legitimacy is fragile, that rules enforced without proof are meaningless, that power relies entirely on consent or in their PR. Evious world, ignorance. By the end of the month, the neighborhood had changed. The quiet fear that had hung over lawns and driveways was gone. Residents were no longer waiting for the board's approval to live their lives. They were empowered, they were vigilant, and they had learned something far more valuable than money or fines. They had learned that the truth could topple even the most entrenched authority. The final and perhaps most profound shift was psychological. The board members who had once walked with confidence now walked cautiously. They avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to communicate through intermediaries or carefully worded letters. Their arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by uncertainty. Every action was now measured against scrutiny. Every decision weighed against accountability. The neighborhood had found its voice, and in that voice lay the ultimate power, because authority built on fear and assumption is fragile. Authority built on intimidation and silence collapses quickly when the people it governs awaken, and that is exactly what had happened here. The power was no longer on the board's side. It was in the hands of the people who had once been afraid, and once people hold power, they do not relinquish it lightly. The $250,000 fine was gone, the threats were gone, the fear was gone, and the HOA, once untouchable, once absolute, had learned a lesson that could never be unlearned. Control without legitimacy is temporary. Obedience without proof is meaningless, and no one can enforce rules on land they do not own. The power shift was complete. The neighborhood was awake, and there was no turning back. By the time the dust settled, the neighborhood was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not because people were scared, not because the HOA had regained control. No, this quiet was different. It was a calm born of clarity, a saint. Illness that comes after a storm when the sky is finally bright again. The $250,000 fine had been officially rescinded. Notices that had been threatening, menacing, and aggressive were returned, nullified, or quietly retracted. The board had issued a formal statement claiming they were reviewing all procedures and compliance measures and promising greater transparency. It sounded procedural, cautious, and almost apologetic, but it did not need to be more than that. The message was clear: they had been caught, but the real lesson extended far beyond money or legal boundaries. Residents began to talk differently about the HOA. Conversations that had been hushed now occurred in backyards, on porches, and over fences. Neighbors shared stories they had kept private for years. They talked about fines they had paid for minor infractions. They talked about the fear of being publicly shamed at meetings. They talked about the frustration of being ignored when they questioned rules, and the humiliation of having their questions dismissed. The stories piled up, and the pattern was undeniable. The HOA had relied on fear, on assumption, on authority that no one verified. Their power had been built not on law but on silence, intimidation, and the belief that people wouldn't check. Now that belief was shattered. For the first time, people realized that knowledge was the ultimate power. A single folder of county records had undone years of fear and control. Original plats, deeds, and filings revealed the truth. The HOA had no ownership of the land it was fining people for. Their rules had been enforced without authority. Their fines had been issued without legitimacy. And the fear that had been instilled in the neighborhood for decades had been based entirely on assumption. This realization sparked a wave of empowerment. Residents began attending meetings more confidently. They asked questions that mattered. They requested records. They documented fines, rules, and notices. They spoke openly about their rights, citing property laws, county regulations, and official filings. Where once they had hesitated, now they spoke with certainty. Where once they had feared reprisal, now they acted with evidence. Even the board members themselves had changed. Those who had once walked with arrogance and control now approached interactions carefully. They were cautious, measured, uncertain. The confidence that had allowed them to issue fines and warnings with impunity was gone. Every action, every decision was now subject to scrutiny. Every word could be questioned, every claim challenged. Their authority, which had once seemed absolute, was fragile and conditional. One by one, the subtle dynamics of the neighborhood shifted. Lawn inspections became collaborative rather than punitive. Notices and letters were now reviewed carefully before being sent. Residents knew their rights, their boundaries, and the limits of the board's authority. They had learned the crucial lesson that authority without proof, rules without foundation, and power without transparency could not endure. The lesson was not only for the HOA, it was for the community as a whole. Residents began to see the importance of vigilance, of checking the facts, and of documenting every interaction with authority. They realized that silence, obedience, or fear only strengthens systems that rely on assumption. Knowledge, attention, and assertion weaken them. Families who had once been quiet, fearful, or resigned now felt empowered. They discussed plans for the future, not just for their homes, but for the neighborhood as a whole. Community projects, safety initiatives, and collaborative gatherings flourished. A culture of accountability and awareness replaced the culture of fear and passive compliance. CE. The HOA, for its part, adapted in a survival mode. They could no longer issue fines arbitrarily. They could no longer assume compliance. They could no longer operate on intimidation alone. Instead, they began adopting transparency measures, reviewing bylaws, and consulting legal counsel before taking action. The change was subtle at first, but necessary. They had learned that enforcing rules without legitimacy comes at a cost far greater than fines or legal fees. It comes at the cost of trust, credibility, and influence. Even years later, the neighborhood remembered the $250,000 fine. They remembered the fear it caused, the uncertainty it imposed, and the sudden shift that came when one person checked the records. It became a cautionary tale about authority, assumption, and the importance of knowing the truth. Children grew up hearing the story of the land their parents owned, and the way a folder of deeds changed everything. New residents were educated from the start. The HOA is real, but its power is conditional. Your rights are real, and knowledge is your strongest defense. The most profound change was psychological. Residents no longer deferred automatically to perceived authority. They questioned, they verified, and they demanded accountability. They learned that power is never permanent when it is built on fear, and that obedience without verification is fragile. That lesson became a collective consciousness in the neighborhood. It shaped decisions, interactions, and community culture for years to come. The $250,000 fine was a singular event, but the awakening it caused was permanent. The HOA could never return to its old ways because the people it governed were no longer passive. The lesson they learned was clear. Legitimacy matters more than intimidation. Proof matters more than perception. Authority built on assumption is temporary, but knowledge is forever. And the people, once frightened, now empowered, never forgot it. Because in the end, truth is the most powerful force there is.